Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I'll share just a couple of procedural things. You'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A function to pose questions to our speaker, Dr. Stevenson. We will make time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions you have and have a lively discussion to answer those questions. You'll also find that there's a survey at the end of the webinar. There will be a QR code on your screen, and my amazing colleague Jason will also pop that into the chat for you if you prefer to use a link. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly, so you can revisit and share this and our previous webinars. I'll put that link in the chat momentarily. Without further ado, welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity's Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With Ava, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series, along with my amazing colleagues, Jason, Andrea, and Isra. Outside of that role, I'm the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children at Simon Fraser University, and I'm faculty at Capilano University in Criminology and Sociology. I'm joining you today from the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, and on behalf of AVA, which is a national initiative, I want to begin by acknowledging that we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is Humans, Animals, and Intimate Partner Violence, Shared Victimizations and Shared Solutions, featuring a colleague and friend of mine, so I'm very excited for this, Dr. Rochelle Stevenson from Thompson Rivers University. Dr. Stevenson is an associate professor of criminology in the Department of Environment, Culture, and Society at Thompson Rivers University, and a faculty member with the Animal and Interpersonal Abuse Research Group. Dr. Stevenson's research focuses on gender-based violence. Her work includes the intersection of interpersonal violence and violence against animals, barriers to help seeking from intimate partner violence, and sexual violence. Dr. Stevenson maintains an intersectional and anti-oppression foundation in her research and activism with two overarching goals: naming, understanding, and stopping violence in any form, and advocating for social justice with inclusive social policy and practice. Dr. Stevenson, welcome. We're so excited for your talk today.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for that introduction. So as Dr. Yursich mentioned, I am Dr. Rochelle Stevenson. I'm a faculty member at Thompson Rivers University, located on the unceded and traditional territories of Tecumseh, Secwepemc, and Secwepemcúlecw, otherwise known as Kamloops, BC. And I'm just grateful to be able to live, work, and play on these lands, recognizing that I am an uninvited guest. I'm also, as Sarah mentioned, a member of the Animal and Interpersonal Abuse Research Group, or APARC, which is a group of interdisciplinary faculty and graduate students, largely housed at the University of Windsor. And really, we look into animal and interpersonal abuse. So much of the work that I'm going to be presenting today represents a lot of our research projects at APARC. So yeah, and I'm happy to discuss any and all of this after the presentation. So companion animals or pets are an important part of life for many people. Right? Our general pet ownership estimates in North America put pets in at least 60% of households, and pets are increasingly being considered family members. Birthdays are celebrated, pets are taken on vacation, Christmas presents. But the status of companion animals as family members also creates a vulnerability. And this vulnerability is realized in situations of intimate partner violence. And so today I'm going to be talking about shared victimizations and shared solutions. So just a short note on content and language. I will be using the language of survivor through the presentation. While I do recognize that IPV or intimate partner violence predominantly impacts women and women identifying folks, we also recognize that anyone of any gender can experience intimate partner violence. I also use the terms animal abuse and animal mistreatment interchangeably. And in terms of content, I'm not presenting any graphic images of human or animal victim survivors. I'm not providing any detailed descriptions of abuse or violence, although we are talking quite directly and about some of the issues that are behaviors that are included in intimate partner violence and animal mistreatment. And just recognize that for many of us, whether we are working in the front lines, working with survivors directly, or survivors ourselves, or academics working in this field, this can be upsetting to think about, the victimization of vulnerable others. And so I encourage you just to do check-ins and practice self-care. So what are we talking about today? Well, there's two kind of main concepts or ideas that we're talking about. One is intimate partner violence, and this is emotional, psychological, physical, financial, and sexual abuse perpetrated by one partner against another in an intimate or romantic relationship. This can be a current or former partner. This could be a dating partner, spouse. It happens among myriad relationship formats. And animal mistreatment. And so this at APARG, we conceptualize this quite broadly. And so we include in animal mistreatment or animal abuse, physical and emotional neglect. And so physical neglect is failure to provide for things like food, water, shelter. Emotional neglect, failure to provide for those emotional needs like social needs and affection. And physical and emotional harm. So physical harm, just like physical abuse would be happening in an intimate partner violence relationship, and emotional harm are things like intimidation or scaring animals on purpose. What we do know is that there's a connection here, that shelter workers, survivors, research literature tells us that survivors who experience IPV are more likely to report that their pets have been threatened or harmed. But at APARC, we wanted to know more about what this connection looked like in the detail in the Canadian context. So we did some research. 2014 was the first time that Statistics Canada had included a question about the mistreatment of animals in the context of IPV in the General Social Survey. It was a single item measure, and the question was, has your partner harmed or threatened to harm your pets? And so team members at APARC analyzed the General Social Survey data and found that animal abuse in the context of IPV tends to follow general IPV victimization trends. Specifically, folks reporting IPV and animal abuse are more likely to be female, to be younger, to be living with a disability, and have a lower income. When digging into the different forms of IPV, the team found that those who reported animal abuse were much more likely to report physical, emotional, sexual, and financial abuse than those who did not experience threats or harm to their pets. So we were starting to get a picture of what this looked like in Canada. But how prevalent is animal mistreatment? And so this was a challenging question to answer. Much of the existing research uses a single question, like the General Social Survey. Has your partner ever harmed or threatened to harm your pets? And research using this single measure shows percentages like 25% to just over 50%, largely dealing with survivor populations. However, a single measure has the tendency to underreport animal mistreatment, as folks might not necessarily count certain behaviors as harm. To address this and to get a more nuanced understanding of animal mistreatment, we at APARG developed the Partner Treatment of Animals Scale, or PTAS. The PTAS is a 21-item measure looking at behaviors that include everything from refusing vet care to scaring an animal on purpose to active harm like killing an animal. It includes both threat to harm and actual harm to the animal. So to test the PTAS, we compiled a survey. We included the PTAS as well as other measures of IPV and distributed the survey to a relatively small sample of 16 domestic violence shelters across Canada. And what we found was that using the PTAS, 89% of women in domestic violence shelters who had pets reported that their pets were mistreated. Pause there for a second. 89%. That's almost 9 in 10 survivors. This is a higher proportion than other studies. Likely, we argue, more accurate as the PTAS is a more comprehensive assessment of animal mistreatment rather than a simple question about harm or threats. But it also showed us that this is not a small problem and that it is affecting multiple survivors. So why is this happening? Why are animals included in victimization of intimate partner violence. Well, one of the predominant explanations for domestic violence overall is the need for power and control on the part of the abuser. Pictured here is an adapted power and control wheel, which was first developed by Pence and Paymar. This one focuses on the inclusion of animals as victims and survivors of domestic violence. So in our survey, we included questions about the survivor's perceptions of the motivations for the abuse of the animal. The need for power and control was central. There was a clear connection between the emotional abuse of the animals, the neglect of the animals, threats to harm the animals, and the perception of the survivors that these actions were motivated by the abuser's desire to maintain or regain control of the situation or exert power over the abused family members. In this way, the abuse of the animal may be treated as a tool to be used by the aggressor in the abuse of the human family members. However, when looking at the relationships that people have with animals, we tend to advocate for a different conceptualization, that of animals as victims and survivors of IPV in their own right. So in our survey, we also asked survivors about leaving the relationship and help seeking, because it's important to recognize that there are many different factors and choices that go into the decision to leave. Our survey of domestic violence shelters and survivors in domestic violence shelters revealed that 56% of women delayed leaving because they were concerned for their companion animal. And it's important to note here that this delay was not hours or days, but this delay was reported in weeks, months, and in some cases, years. And 1/3 of our respondents reported that they were considering returning to their abuser because the abuser still had the animal. These statistics are concerning for two reasons. One, survivors are not leaving because there is no safe place to go that also offers safety for their human family member or animal family members. This keeps all family members in a situation of risk and harm. And two, survivors are returning because their pets are at risk. This can include threats or harm to the animal in retaliation for leaving, refusal to care for the animals, so that intentional neglect. We also know that the time period immediately surrounding a separation is the highest risk for intimate partner homicide. So policies and programs that allow companion animals and humans to find safe haven together is critical for the safety of everyone. A second component of this particular study was also a survey for staff members at the 16 shelters to see what their perceptions and knowledge was about the connection between intimate partner violence and animal abuse. When looking at the data from the survivors in the shelter and shelter staff, it gave us an overview of some of the barriers that survivors face when seeking safety with pets. First is a lack of animal-friendly programs. And survivors are often faced with having to leave what can be the single form of positive support behind. We know that a tactic of abusers in situations of intimate partner violence is isolation. This can be geographic isolation, but very often this is social isolation, isolating the survivor from family, friends, supports. The companion animal can sometimes represent that last positive relationship. We also found that questions about pets are inconsistently or not asked at all on intake. Sometimes it depended on who was answering the phone when clients called for service. This represents a lack of information that the survivors are getting. And that is a barrier to help seeking because it's a gap in information. Our survey also found that clients were not informed or not consistently informed about pet programs that might have been available. So even when there were programs in place, about half of our survivors were not informed about the programs, and about 25% were only informed once they were already in shelter. Again, this is information that would be very helpful in order to help facilitate those help-seeking decisions on the part of survivors. And there's also the perception and communication that domestic violence shelters are for human survivors only, for women and children only. Another study that some of our team members at APARC did was an analysis of shelter websites across Canada. And the shelter website study showed that less than 1% of shelter websites identified that they offered pet programs for survivors with pets. But yet, anecdotally, and just from kind of working with shelters across Canada, we knew that the proportion was more than that. But what we do know is that there's little communication on websites, so that public-facing kind of, information for the domestic violence shelters, communicating the inclusion of pets in intimate partner violence and what programs might be there for survivors who might need those programs. And we know that survivors might seek out that information when making decisions about help seeking. And so that lack of information is a barrier. So, what do services for IPV survivors with pets actually look like in Canada? Well, we did another study for that. And so we started a project with Red Rover, which is a nonprofit organization out of the United States, to help figure out what was actually out there in terms of service. Our research team reached out via telephone to every domestic violence service agency in Canada and the United States, including shelters, transition houses, and other agencies providing direct services to survivors. This was a lot of calls. In Canada, we contacted 522 agencies with a 44% response rate. And so this was a really great response rate, and we were happy with that. And this is what the picture of safe pet programs in Canada looks like. It's varied. Some agencies offered multiple services, and so that's reflected in the percentages presented here. A heartening result was that 21% of shelters offered on-site housing. And this is where the animals were living in the shelter with their people, or, for example, on a kennel on shelter property. An additional 3% of shelters stated that only approved service animals were allowed in the shelter in line with legislated accessibility requirements. So 37% of agencies offered off-site options. And so this included agreements with things like animal shelters, veterinary clinics, foster programs. And often off-site programs were paired with on-site or referral programs. And so an additional 37% provided a referral to other services. And so this again is the animal shelters, veterinary clinics, foster care, sometimes animal rescue organizations, with an additional 3% stating that they would refer the client to another domestic violence shelter. In these cases, the clients would make their own arrangements with the external agency for the safe home for their animal prior to or just after entering shelter. The ad hoc kind of category is where the agency or organization did whatever they could in the moment to make sure that everyone was safe. And the other category included suggesting family and friends take care of the pet or paying for boarding for the animal themselves. I think importantly, and this is the column on the right of your screen, a full 21% offered no services at all, with an additional 3% being unsure if the agency offered pet services. So this is a gap in services. This could be a geographic gap. Again, we're still kind of teasing out some of this data. But that means that there's spaces across Canada where there is no services at all. And that there are folks who are unsure if their agency offers services, which again translates to either a lack of communication of this information or perhaps inconsistent communication of this information to survivors. As part of this, kind of the staff survey, we also inquired about barriers to implementing a safe pet program. And the top three we basically see in some of the other studies that we've looked at as well: allergies, concerns around safety, and concerns around space. We recognize that a one-size-fits-all approach to what a pet program might look like is unrealistic. But there does appear to be an inconsistency in both format and availability of safe pet programs for families who need safety from intimate partner violence. Government agencies, such as BC Housing, are encouraging shelters to consider how they can be pet-friendly, recognizing that this is a barrier to help seeking. But we recognize the burdens on domestic violence shelters and the sector as a whole, and a policy without funding is not realistic. A better process would be to dedicate funds enabling shelters to become pet-friendly, or at least have an option or program for housing pets, and then mandate that all domestic violence services offering housing have pet programs in place. But both components need to be implemented: the requirement plus sufficient and comprehensive funding to be able to do so. So We know that supporting survivors with trauma-informed understandings, validation of experiences, and recognition of survivor agency is crucial. We also know that the domestic violence service sector, the agencies are under-resourced, overworked, asked to do more with less all the time. So why should a consideration of animals be added into the mix? Not only for the reason that animals may be another victim of the relationship violence, and our collective goal is to stop the violence, but also for the impact that this violence has on the human survivor. And while we have a lot of data on how IPV impacts survivors along multiple dimensions, physical, financial, emotional, psychological, sexual, relational, we have very little research into how intimate partner violence and animal abuse impacts survivors. So we did a study for that. We decided to investigate the impact of intimate partner violence and animal abuse on the well-being of intimate partner violence survivors. So with the funding support of HABRI, which is the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, an institute out of Washington, D.C., we explored two main questions. One, what are the well-being impacts on survivors of experiencing IPV and animal mistreatment as part of the violence? And two, how do companion animals influence healing from the violence, and how does the human-animal relationship contribute to health and well-being? To address the first question, we analyzed the data from the Statistics Canada Survey of Safety in Public and Private Spaces, which was run in 2018. We selected this data set because it was a large general population survey, unlike our previous work, which is focused exclusively on shelter samples. The Survey of Safety in Public and Private Spaces had comprehensive modules on a number of different variables that we were interested in. One on intimate partner violence also included two questions on animal abuse. The question was, again, a single item measure: has your partner ever harmed or threatened to harm your pet? But it also included a second question on frequency. How frequently had this happened in the past 12 months? It also included comprehensive modules on mental health and well-being, including questions around post-traumatic stress disorder, symptomology, coping mechanisms, and stress. So we complemented this quantitative analysis with qualitative interviews with 43 survivors, again drawn from the general population. And these participants were recruited via posters at vet clinics and pet stores across Canada. So I am going to present some of our information from this study. There's still manuscripts in preparation for this, and we are still kind of going through the qualitative interviews. So some of this data is a little bit preliminary, but yeah, hopefully if you have any questions, I'm happy to chat about it after. So the general measures of well-being. So from the Safety of Survey in Public and Private Spaces, we established three groups. A group who reported no intimate partner violence. This was our largest group. The group that reported intimate partner violence only, so no reports of animal mistreatment. And then the smallest group represented IPV and animal abuse together. So the data presented here represent those who reported violence in the previous 12 months from the date of the survey. And due to small cell counts, we recoded some of the ordinal variables, for example, the self-rated health variables, into dichotomous categories. So we kind of grouped the excellent and good responses together, the poor and fair responses together, in order to evaluate group differences using chi-square analyses. So if we look at the self-rated general health at the top, what we have is 11.5% of folks who reported no IPV reported their self-rated general health as poor or fair. A little bit more than that, so about 12% of folks who reported intimate partner violence only rated their self-rated general health at poor to fair. But when we look at the folks who experienced intimate partner violence and animal abuse, almost 18% of these folks rated their general health as poor to fair. And we see this trend repeat in self-rated mental health, with a significantly higher proportion of folks who reported intimate partner violence and animal abuse reporting that their mental health was poor to fair. There was also questions on the survey asking about long-term disorders diagnosed by a medical professional. And so if we look at mood disorder, anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, we also see those same differences and that same trend repeating, that folks who experienced intimate partner violence and animal abuse the proportions were much higher for those folks reporting that, yes, they had been diagnosed for mood disorder, anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. There was also a question about suicidality. Have you ever seriously contemplated suicide? And this was a yes or no response. And what we can see here is, again, there's a significant difference among our groups, and that folks who reported intimate partner violence and animal abuse reported the yes, that they had seriously contemplated suicide at a much higher proportion than the other groups. So overall, what we see here is that the experience of intimate partner violence and animal abuse has a negative impact and direct negative impact on the well-being of human survivors. So for the second research question, we talked to the survivors and we asked about the relationship that they have with their pets, the impact on their well-being, and the impact on their healing. And so these are just a couple of quotes from the survivors that I talked to over the summer. For the first one, the participant is sharing about guilt. And this was a fairly consistent theme that came up through our interviews, with that the guilt and the shame that survivors were experiencing. But again, notice that she was affected by the abuse, that I feel bad about that. I feel a lot of guilt because I put my dog through that. And so there's that sense of guilt and responsibility. The second survivor quoted here shared that she had been diagnosed with PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, mainly due to abuse experienced in two separate relationships. But she also spoke quite frankly about the fact that she had seriously contemplated suicide, and that, as she kind of relates here, that if it wasn't for her animals, that she would have taken her own life, and that they actually did keep her alive. And so in this way, that relationship is important as a protective factor. We also asked about hope and healing. And so one of the questions we invited survivors to think about was, what role had their pets played in their healing process? And again, the role that the pets had played in their overall well-being. So in this first quote here, the participant was speaking about how her relationship had essentially demolished her sense of self-worth, and that she really wanted her cats, to see and feel her best self. And she said that her cats really provided a mirror to her to show her who she really was, because she felt that she had lost herself in her abusive relationship. And she says, all those hours of caring for them and loving them, like, they represent my best self. And so for her, caring for her animals were part of her healing process, part of showing her that she had worth and value. This participant was quite direct, said, I don't know if I could have healed and felt full and whole without them. Again, speaking to the importance of that relationship. And this last quote speaks to the reciprocity embedded in the human-animal relationship. So this participant shared that her dogs had also experienced abuse in the relationship, and that part of her healing was seeing the dogs heal emotionally as well. She also had spoken about the difficulty in leaving the relationship. This participant had lived in her car. She had basically lost all of her financial resources. But for her, despite all of that hardship, that it was the correct decision for her and for her animals. She said, it was the correct decision, just to know that they're happy and they're living the life that they deserve. And by proxy, the life that the survivor deserves as well. And so there's a lot of hope represented here, and also a lot of healing and reciprocal healing that happens through that human-animal relationship. So where do we go from here? There was a lot of information kind of presented through the presentation so far. And so what do we do with it? Well, there's a number of things that we can do, and kind of broken into two categories. One is to increase services for survivors with companion animals. And this can be more inclusive programs across the gender-based violence spectrum. This can include the simple things like asking questions when clients call. Is there a pet at home that you're concerned about? Including in things like safety planning. Even opening the conversation with clients about what their concerns are, what those barriers might be, is an important part of recognizing the importance of the human-animal bond, but also helping problem solve some of those barriers for survivors. And These conversations can also generate statistics that can be used as evidence for funding applications, showing the need for funding for pet programs, showing the need for collaboration with community agencies. Take a look at your own organization if you work in this sector. What could you do to be more inclusive? Start the conversation, but also recognize and be realistic about some of those challenges for your organization. But also realize at the same time that there is a number of organizations in Canada that are offering pet programs in one form or another. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Network and talk to folks in your sector. What's working? And please feel free to reach out to us at APARG if you have questions or you want to start something, and we can certainly connect you with someone who might be doing something similar. Also, advocating for more pet inclusive housing. We know that one of the challenges when folks want to leave an abusive relationship, whether they're going into shelter or leaving shelter, is housing. And housing is challenging to find even if you don't have animals. And so, more pet inclusive housing might reduce or minimize that barrier for many of our survivors. An important thing of what we can do is we can increase recognition, our own recognition of the importance of the human animal bond. Many of the survivors we spoke with speak about guilt, shame, and judgment regarding either their choice to stay and protect the animal or leave with the animal. We need to reduce the stigma and recognize the importance of the relationship between the human survivor and their companion animal, the influence that this relationship has on their well-being, and that reciprocal healing from the intimate partner violence. So we really need to value the relationship as the survivor does. So just kind of as I wrap up, leaving lots of time for questions, I just wanted to kind of do a thank you and a moment of gratitude for the support that we've received across our research agendas. The first project I talked about was supported by the SSHRC Insight Development Grant, and that was the pilot testing and development of the partner treatment of animal scale. Our work with Red Rover, looking at what safe pet programs were out there across North America, was supported by a SSHRC Partnership Engage grant. And as mentioned, the more recent work that we're doing on intimate partner violence, animal abuse, and well-being is supported by the Human Animal Bond Research Institute. And importantly and critically, our gratitude for the contributions from survivors and those who work in the IPV sector. This work wouldn't be possible without the time, their energy, their contributions, and their voice. And so our gratitude goes out to everyone who has contributed to our work to this point. And that is the presentation for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. As always, absolutely fabulous and important presentation. And I know you've talked a lot broadly, and I'll ask a couple questions as we kind of give our attendees space to put things in the Q&A. And that's
Sure.
a prompt for our attendees to definitely add questions to Q&A if they have them. I know you've done a lot of work in this area, and I know you're also acutely aware of the issues between, like, say, rural and urban settings. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to risks or dynamics in rural settings that might change what you've spoken about here.
So, rural settings is an interesting thing when we think about some of the specific challenges that survivors might face um, on a couple of different levels. I know that Crystal Giesbrecht out of Saskatchewan has done some really great work in this space as well. But really, when we're thinking about rural spaces, we have to think about perhaps the different companion animals that folks might have. And so it might be larger companion animals like horses, for example. We also think about animals not necessarily as companions necessarily, but also livestock. And so these animals could represent financial security for the survivors. And so if they have to leave, where do you move, right? 45 cattle, it's difficult to do. Um, and that financial security might be part of, right, that exit strategy from the relationship. There's also the notion that in smaller or rural communities, there's fewer people around and people are more likely to know each other and know their neighbors. And so it's difficult to find a space that they might be able to go where their abuser might not know where they are. And so they might actually have to leave their home community, leave whatever network and support they might have in order to seek safety. That also includes possibly moving their animals as well, sometimes great distances. And so These are all complications, kind of just off the top, that a rural or a remote community might experience in terms of what the survivors might have to deal with and some of those additional barriers.
Absolutely. And I think too, and speaking of things like barriers, I know you and I have had these conversations before, but what are your thoughts around, say, shelters and transition houses, those that do accept companion animals and those that don't, and what difference that might make in a survivor's life?
I think, again, I feel like in some ways the co-sheltering model where humans and animals stay together it can be a really effective model for survivors. It keeps the family intact, especially if there's children involved. That can be a source of support for kids, especially in a time of upheaval. Um, and it also, again, as some of my survivors spoke about, that responsibility for like having to get up out of bed in the morning and having to care for somebody and a being other than themselves is can be a positive motivator to kind of start taking those steps on healing journeys. And so for many survivors, that is the preferred option. There's also survivors where that I spoke to where they're like, I couldn't do it. I just needed to focus on myself. I couldn't even care for myself. There's no way I could care for somebody else. And so, in those situations, that survivor recognized that the best way that they could care for their animals is by taking care of themselves first, getting their own kind of stuff settled a little bit more, and then starting to care for the animal. And so, in those cases, foster programs might be the better option because the animal is safe. There could be visitation, but yet, really thinking about what's best for the animal in those cases is can be a really good piece. And so that's one of the reasons why we advocate for thinking about what might be best for your own shelter or own organization, as well as your own clientele. And having a couple of different options really reduces that additional barrier for survivors and helps give them a little bit more agency, which you know is really important in that situation when folks are contemplating leaving.
Absolutely. And I think the way you've shared that or expressed that is very powerful in the sense of it's meeting people's needs where they're at. Some people need to bring their animals, some people need support where their animals are safe, but maybe not with them. It's incredibly important. And I know you've been doing this research for quite a while. This is core to your work and it's such important work. But throughout your time researching this, engaging in these discussions, are there shifts that you saw in how people think about this or approach it?
Yes. So when I first started doing this research, I will say in my undergraduate degree, one of my first projects was doing the same kind of thing, looking at the picture of safe pet programs, and I focused on Western Canada, so BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And at that time, I want to say less than 10% of shelters offered on-site programs. And everyone I talked to kind of at that time had said, yeah, we know about the problem. We know about the overlap between intimate partner violence and animal abuse, but we don't know what to do about it. We're not asking the questions when survivors call. And then we fast forward to the study that we did with Red Rover, and we see vastly different proportions across the country. So we see more folks offering on-site programs, so that co-sheltering model. We see 37% of our respondents saying that they have an agreement or at least kind of some sort of relationship to be able to offer safe pet programs to survivors. And so we've seen shifts and improvements in that space, and that is helping survivors in the moment. So we've seen improvement. Ideally, we want a program or, no um, survivor should be forced to leave their pet behind. And so ideally, we want something across Canada, and we're getting there. It's just taken
Absolutely.
time.
It is promising to see that those shifts are taking place, but it's still in some ways disheartening to think that it isn't where we need it to be now.
True, but I also see that there is changes happening, for example, at the government level. So the Standing Committee on the Status of Women put out a report a couple of years ago, and they actually used some of our research from APARG with recommendations on including education for judges on the link between intimate partner violence and animal mistreatment and the power of coercive control, and also recommending funding for domestic violence shelters to be able to enable them to be pet friendly. I mean, it's a recommendation, but it's still starting to reach policy making tables at the highest levels. And so that's I also feel a really important shift.
Yeah. That's incredible. I was unaware that those were taking place. That's incredible. We do have an audience question from Ken who says, I am hearing a lot about cross-reporting, like between a healthcare provider and, say, animal control officers, where it might lead to a person's need for a shelter who has a dog. Do you have any more insights on that concept?
Yes, I think that that would be an amazing thing if we can get it in place. Part of the challenge with some of our cross-reporting initiatives is that very often it's because it's one or two staff members at the agencies that have those relationships. And it can be difficult to get a memorandum of understanding and a specific process in place. And so sometimes with staff turnover, those cross-reporting falls apart a little bit. But we do have mandatory reporters in terms of child mistreatment. And we are seeing more recognition that the inclusion of either active neglect or abuse of animals can be considered as part of child mistreatment and is also considered part of a violent dynamic. So when we do see things like the Ministry of Children and Family Development or social workers engaging with families where there's animals there, that could be a space where they can cross-report. And certainly when it comes to animal cruelty investigations or complaints, that would also be a really great space to be able to cross-report and let folks know. But that tends to be almost like agency or locality to locality.
Yeah, I think we think about cross-reporting in a lot of different spheres around violence, and it definitely poses some unique challenges, but would be very important work. Let's see. I don't see any other Q&As coming in, so I have one final question for you, and then we can wrap up for the day. And this is one of those things where, like an ideal world kind of question. So if you had a magic wand and you could make a change, a big one, what would it be?
Wow. A magic wand that can make a change. What would it be? It would be that no human or animal experiences violence again, would be my magic wand. Um, Realistically, I'm not sure that that's going to happen. My magic wand would be that we have sufficient and comprehensive funding so that every service agency that serves survivors of violence never has to turn anyone away, whether that's being space or because they have animals or whatever. That would be my magic wand.
That is such a beautiful response. Thank you. And on behalf of Ava and myself, thank you, Rochelle, for sharing your space, your time, and your wisdom with us today. We're so deeply appreciative. And my colleague Jason will pop a link to a survey in the chat. There's also the QR code on the screen for you. And please take a moment to take the survey. It's helpful for us, it's helpful for Rochelle. And again, thank you, Rochelle, so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today.
An absolute pleasure.